what did you first read of Raymond Williams? Like, that's what made me think.
Okay.
And at what point in your life was that?
Well, two things. The first was Border Country,
Yeah.
the novel, and I was entranced by it. When it was, I would say, 70s, maybe. It's partly about the characters. It's partly, as I say, about the relationship between the son and the father. And, you know, at the end, although reading it more recently, it didn't come across to me in quite the way that I thought.
Yeah.
I imagined it had, and that is the father dies, Harry, and my memory was that, you know, the character is actually Raymond, sitting in the bedroom while the father dies. He can't find words because although there's a closeness between them, there is an inability to express certain deep emotions for a range of reasons, and we can think about that.
Yeah.
Actually, he's not sitting there in the novel when I reread it again, but I thought this touches on aspects of it's this auto/biographical dynamic. Aspects of my own relationship with my father, because I couldn't, whatever the deep feeling I might have had, I couldn't express it, and neither could he express that towards me. So Border Country was incredibly significant. The other book, which was certainly around for me in the 60s and then the 70s, and to be very truthful, I've only really got to grips with it much more recently, was the Long Revolution. I used to say somewhat pretentiously when I was a city councillor based in Carlisle to some of my Labour colleagues, you should read that. It will give you a wider perspective on what it is that we're trying to do. And they bring it back saying, looking utterly bemused, saying something like, I can't be doing with that, Linden. And you know, some of his writing isn't easy, but it's coming back to it, I think. And if we're talking about, you know, the themes of democracy and democratization and structures of feeling which are democratic, I do love his sense of historical movement, which somehow gets us out of, you know, the latest defeat of the Labour Party and gives us a much broader view. And
the longer view as well, isn't it?
The long view. And if we're talking about the interplay of, you know, this is in the Long Revolution, authoritarianism, paternalism, and then more democratic modes of being and structures of feeling, then maybe these are lost for a while, but will come back again. I mean, there's a sense in him maybe of a collective consciousness that, you know, things are away working at some level, and then they will come back, and people will. Actually, I've thought of this recently. It's partly in the context of psychoanalysis and Raymond Williams, and that maybe he would have had a more liberal, sympathetic attitude than some people have thought. But I'm thinking now in terms of gender and gender relationships, and I think the work that's taking place almost in front of our eyes, tragically because of what happened to Sarah Everard, but the sense of intense relationship and the possibility of saying things and feeling things, which then allows new thoughts to come into existence in certain kinds of women's relationships, but also women and men, because I think part of what needs to happen, and is happening to some extent, is that men have to start talking much more about their feelings and their responsibilities for what is happening. So in a cultural sense, I think we've got, on the one hand, the appalling violence done to women, and, you know, Sarah Everard is very much in our minds at the moment. On the other hand, you've got a movement, it seems to me, in gendered relations, which is opening new possibility. And I think Raymond Williams would have been aware of that. And he wouldn't have just, you know, referenced feminism as one, or the peace movement as one example. He would, I think, dug deep there and got into this kind of structure of feeling which is evolving in front of our eyes.
I mean, what I was thinking as you were speaking, Linden, and I was thinking about this, I've been thinking about this a lot, particularly this week, given what you've just said, and also the policing bill that's got through its second reading, as I understand, incredibly frightening, was, you know, about these when he talks about the long revolution. The hope is, in my mind at least, two things really. One, this long cycle that you're almost possibly describing as well, and a sense that culture remains ordinary, to use one of his, you know, or to reference one of his key phrases and ideas, and somehow therefore we're still meaning making, we're still getting along with it, we're still trying to work things out, a bit like you just said about gender relationships. That doesn't stop. So the hope and the optimism is in the continued revolution.
Yeah, and I also think it's important to locate that, and it's very topical because of what's happened tragically. I mean, it's very interesting when you look at Raymond Williams' biography, of course, that he was a tank commander, although some people describe him as an anti-tank commander. I don't quite, which is right, in Normandy. He was on the beaches of Normandy and in the fields, and what he must have witnessed is horrific.
Yeah, I never think about that. That's amazing. Yeah.
Yeah, and he became, you know, he opted out of the Korean War on the grounds of, you know, conscientious objection, no doubt, forged by what he'd seen. It's very clear in his writing that there are people who call themselves progressive or socialists of whatever kind, who occasionally are attracted by violence. And on the whole, I don't think, and I think Raymond Williams was saying this, I don't think the historic record is very good on this. My own view is that we're still haunted. There's a funny story about the Chinese foreign secretary who was asked about what his view was of the French Revolution. And he responded some years ago now, he said, well, it's too early to judge. And I think the feeling that, you know, how do you get this momentous event, which was so full of hope, and my God, it affects English history as well, and British history so enormously.
Yeah.
And yet somehow we end up at the Committee of Public Safety.
Yeah.
Yeah. And I'm thinking that Raymond was probably tortured by that. I feel tortured by it because it can be very attractive to think in terms of violence. But I think on the whole, it's a dangerous illusion. And part of the long revolution, I think, is to cultivate, sure, it involves resistance, sure, it involves, you know, Rosa Parks moments. I mean, it's not about sitting down, just doing nothing. But I think violence is something that, on the whole, I think he decided, and I agree with him, is creates more problems than it solves.
Yeah. So do you think he gets the sense of, well, no, that the capacity to continue outside of a Marxist framework? This is my sense of the tension he had with Marxism, or some Marxist thinkers, if that makes any sense. I wonder if that is his is something about a kind of continuity with community, with people. It's more focused on people than an ideology, or I'm groping about for this, but do you know what I mean?
I do know what you mean. I think the whole question of Raymond Williams' Marxism has been subject of debate. And as well, you know that when he was working in adult education, in some of the great conflicts, he was thought, his interest in culture and literature was thought of as very tangential and kind of avoidant of the real stuff that who we are was created in the kind of in our relationships, in processes of production.
Exactly.
And he couldn't quite kind of reduce his own experience and the experience with those that he was encountering into that kind of slightly narrow frame. I mean, he did accept a notion of determinism, but it wasn't the determinism of the old kind of structural Marxists who thought of base and superstructure. It was quite different, and I think that's what I like about him, actually.
I love Marxism and literature for that. I think that's my favourite work of his, actually.
I think he's bigger than Marxism.
I do. And he's certainly he's certainly more humane than post-structuralism. So, you know, he's got that, he brings a kind of critical lens and a structural lens, but it comes together in structures of feeling for me. That's kind of the nub of it.
I think his humanism is incredibly powerful.
Exactly.
I don't think, you know, the grand debates about, you know, socialism and individualism, I think in his way of framing it, you know, he couldn't take actual people and their complexities out of the equation in terms of the struggle for something better. And that there is, as you know, and I came across this in my own life when I was a student, a postgraduate student. There were ways of talking about Marxism in complete abstraction. And I couldn't have articulated what I meant then, what I felt then as I can now. But the sense of the terror, it's massification. It's massification that's the problem. That you lose a sense of individuals and they become a mass. And of course, what Raymond taught about that was as true of, you know, the manipulators of Madison Avenue and the capitalist mentality as it was of certain kinds of people and tendencies like Leninism and the Communist Party.
Yeah.
The masses were to be, you know, instructed either or infiltrated into the ways the market all. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, that's how I say it. I remember having a discussion with someone very close to me who was a communist about a statue of the dying Gaul that I'd seen in Paris. Forget which gallery it was in, but anyway, I was very deeply moved by the sinews, the beauty of the marble, the way it had been carved to represent this dying figure, this dying human being, and was massively touched by it, and was trying to articulate this to him, and he was absolutely indifferent to it, because I didn't try to understand this figure, this statue, in a political context, in terms of what that figure represented politically, culturally, economically. And I just think that's absolutely reductionist in my mind. You know, that reduces, and I was incoherent because I often am when I'm trying to express difficult things. I guess we all are. It takes a lot of effort, doesn't it, to try and bring out this, you know, morass of thinking and feeling into something formed in words. So I was trying very hard to explain to him the kind of emotional response to this figure. It was absolutely a matter of indifference to him, and I was really shocked.
You see, I something profoundly anti-human and anti-educational and that kind of response, because if we start saying that only some responses to something are legitimate, then we start denying who we are, and our journeys can be many and varied, and sometimes, you know, it's incredibly important to be respectful towards people. It's a bit like, I imagine, Raymond Williams was in a literature class. You probably have incredible responses and different responses, but to remain respectful is very important. I mean, I still struggle with, you probably picked this up in one or two things I've said, because I guess there's still a religious part of me. And that within the progressive movement in England, there always has been, actually, and I think it's there in the work of Edward Thompson, for instance, his work on Blake, and I think we annihilate people like Blake at our great peril. But I remember having a similar experience in St. Peter's in Rome, and this is quite a long time ago, and I was overwhelmed by the Pietà. And, you know, the figure of the dead Christ and Mary. And, you know, for a long time, I thought, well, at the time, I cried. I went out. I didn't even know it was Michelangelo. I went down the road opposite St. Peter's. I bought a card because I was going to send a card home. Still in the days we used postcards. And then I saw it was by Michelangelo. I just cried. And the point is that, you know, those are feelings. And to say that some feelings are well, you can't be doing with religion. Religion is opposed to the masses, etc., etc. That is not educational, in my view.
No, it's not, and it's reducing human experience. That's what I felt really profoundly. I mean, I wouldn't have been able to articulate as a girl without the vocabulary, without the language. My dad struggled with this as well. If I saw a picture, if I went to a gallery, I mean, I love art, but I might not be able to explain why something so profoundly touched and moved me. You know, I didn't have the language for it. And it's something about giving space for that feeling and being absolutely respectful of it. It's so difficult to explore those kinds of feelings.
I would imagine, and again, I can't quite get into a tutorial class with Raymond Williams, although I can get close, that he was a very tolerant man.
Yeah,
and that he was open and allowed people, and to claim some space. He might gently disagree and say, well, there's another point of view. And I think in that sense, he was sometimes more direct than, say, Richard Henry Tawney was, who would never really commit himself to a position. But I would guess he did that almost, and this is a word that hasn't always gone down well in progressive circles, almost do it in a loving way. Here's a fellow human being struggling to articulate something, and I have a responsibility towards that human being.
I completely agree with you. It's the deep humanity. It is humane. I can imagine that. I can imagine feeling safe with them.
Yeah, which is another thing
that's really important for me. I mean, as this terrified creature going up to Cambridge, an alien, utterly alien world, I would have it would have been like coming home and having a safe father figure almost, without being ridiculous, but honestly, someone who might protect and support me.
I love, and I was just looking for the quote of Raymond in Cambridge, by the way.
I love that.
which I came across, and I didn't know before, but it's. I mean, he talks about being in a tea shop.
Yes,
and, the performativity in the tea shop, and
exactly.
The appallingly blown up nonsense being performed, as it were, by supposedly very cultured people.
Yeah.
But I love this this quote. The myth of the working class boy arriving in Cambridge is that he is an awkward misfit and has to learn new manners.
Yeah.
Out of rural Wales, it didn't feel like that. The class which has dominated Cambridge is given to describing itself as well-mannered and polite, sensitive. It continually contrasts itself favorably with the rougher and coarser ones. If then I say that what I found was an extraordinarily coarse, pushing, name-ridden group, I should be told I'm expressing class feeling, class envy, class resentment.
Yeah.
That I show class feeling is not in any doubt. All I would insist on is that nobody fortunate to grow up in a good home in a genuinely well-mannered and sensitive community could for a moment envy these loud, competitive, deprived people.
No, I thought it is brilliant. I quoted that in my bit because I just thought, bloody hell, if only I'd come across
this. From your paper. It's from your paper. I got that.
Yeah.
I should acknowledge that. Of course.
Yeah, no, but I mean that it's just because it meant something to me, because I struggled, thinking I should ape these people. I remember one of my fellow students who was had many nice qualities. I'm not trying to reduce her to something, but her father was a merchant banker, and she just had this. She oozed this sense of, I don't know what the word is, kind of. Not complacency, but a sense of privilege. Yeah, exactly. And and I remember her paying, this is in the mid to late 80s, so this is £600 for a ball gown for one of the May balls or something, and I think I'd spent a £5 trying to find something anyway. But that's by the by. But her room was disarray, everywhere. There were beautiful perfume bottles on the floor. There was a powder puff, for a face powder, just strewn all over the room with these amazing clothes and I just remember thinking that must be what it is to have total confidence in money. because it didn't mean anything, if that makes, and I'm sure it did, and I may be putting all kinds of unfair kind of presumptions onto her, and that but that memory stands firm in my mind, that sense of, wow, some people don't have to value all that stuff in the same way,
It makes me feel, though, that part of Raymond had this distinction he drew between social conscience and social consciousness, and the raising of social consciousness, which was the role of adult education. And in framing it, I have to say that sometimes, and I don't know the person you're referring to, but sometimes those who appear to occupy and colonize space without any effort can be deeply troubled. And I think, in a sense, making some of that conscious is important. I in my other work, I've seen examples of people who occupy space apparently with effortless ease, but the price of doing that has been enormous. And I think of the present times we live in, where the feelings of entitlement and privilege in government have come back with a menace.
Absolutely.
As part of the long counter revolution. But you think of people like Johnson and his own upbringing, and the divorce of his parents, and this troubled relationship with his mother, who I think really suffered. So sometimes these grand characters who occupy and colonize space and close others down, if the process in historic terms is about raising social consciousness, we need to include something about what underlies in the unconscious. It needs to be made conscious. Some of these bombastic, colonizing expressions.
And it is a public consciousness, isn't it? I mean, it's almost a public pedagogy. It's exposing some of this, I guess. And we don't do it, and that's what I was trying to say about in my piece about Raymond Williams as a public intellectual. We just too infrequently, in my view, or too frequently, it's about an academic perspective, which tends to be couched in language a lot of people don't relate to or don't connect with, or doesn't ever get outside the confines of academia. That's another issue. And I think that Raymond Williams was trying really hard to move. I don't know how well he succeeded. I genuinely couldn't comment on this, because I've often wondered how big an audience he had. It's like we're trying to develop these explainers at the moment, to try and explore some of his key ideas and thoughts. And I have no idea how far he resonates outside, a particular world. I don't know. But I think he tried to be a public intellectual, if that's the right expression. I'm not even sure it is. But he did try to articulate, to my mind, a public pedagogy to expose some of these issues, as you've tried to do with Distress in the City. I felt, you're bringing the internal world together with the kind of the external, and trying to explore the interconnection. I think that's why I like the book so much.
Thank you. I would imagine that he must have struggled with this in his classes in places like Hastings and Bexley, as we all have from time to time in adult education. And I think if we reflect on our histories as teachers in adult education, I sometimes have to say, there are moments of profound embarrassment. And I recognize in myself, so this is not projecting onto others, that I can kind of soon be lost in jargon when I don't really know what I'm talking about. And when I think there's something about the internalization of understanding, which is, I think, something you've touched on about, that you can find in literature, where somehow you've come across a character or an idea and you've internalized that idea, and maybe initially with difficulty, maybe you thought, well, I don't want anything to do with this. I hate this character. But something kind of works away in you, and there's a kind of dialectic going on. And out of the antithesis, as it were, it becomes a thesis, which is a much more integrated view, part of which is forged in your own experience and your own understanding of experience born in the dialectic. And that's when I think you can begin to talk to people in a more grounded, a less pompous way. But, you know, that kind of thing, you know, I know that Raymond didn't entirely take to Eliot, and they had profound disagreements, of course, about popular culture. But I think the sense of Eliot's phrase in, I think it's The Wasteland, or maybe it's the Four Quartets, about simplicity costing not less than everything, and maybe the capacity to talk about complex things in simple and accessible ways does actually cost not less than everything.
Yeah, I agree, and I think it's profoundly important as well, and I think he does achieve that on occasion, to my mind.
No, I think that's right.
And then he's also extraordinarily complex and difficult to read in other places. It's been an absolutely fascinating conversation, to be honest, Linden. I mean, do you sort of feel like I don't know. I keep going back to, you know, the profound connection with structures of feeling,
yes,
and also how that's somehow helping me to think through some of my own autobiographical tensions, going back to where we started. And it's such a deep phrase, isn't it, when you start to really engage with it and
play with it. Let him play with it and let it play with you. I think playfulness is a much undervalued aspect of the work we do.
Yeah, absolutely. So I just want to thank you. It's been
Well, thank you for giving me the space.